Snow had begun its quiet conquest of the city when Yuki left cram school and hurried toward the riverbank. The Lantern Festival was already awake, and from across the bridge, he could see the paper lights rising like fragile suns, drifting upward with a kind of defiant gentleness. He hadn't meant to come, not really. The plan had been home, warmth, textbooks, but he knew she would be there. She was always there. Aya's family ran the tea house at the end of the lane, the one with wooden blinds that rattled in summer storms. They had made lanterns for the festival for generations, and Aya treated the paper and bamboo with reverence, as if every fold carried someone's memory. Yuki had once seen her in the back room, lips pressed to a lantern frame as though whispering life into it before the flame was lit. He spotted her among the crowd, snow catching in her hair, scarf wound too many times around her neck. She was showing a child how to hold the lantern by its base so the flame wouldn't burn fingers. Her hands moved carefully, her smile even more so. Yuki stood watching too long, until she looked up and saw him. The smile changed, then something private, something almost shy. They met near the bridge's arch. He lifted a hand in awkward greeting. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that made the cold recede a little. Without words, she pressed the lantern into his hands. Their fingers brushed. The thin paper trembled between them. Together they walked to the riverbank, shoulders close, breaths mixing in the air. Around them families murmured prayers and couples leaned into each other's warmth. Aya knelt at the water's edge, steadying her lantern until it found its reflection. Yuki crouched beside her, holding his own uncertainly. She guided his hand, letting the lantern kiss the water. It bobbed once, then glided forward, joining the small fleet of lights already drifting downstream. For a while, they just watched. The lanterns gathered like constellations across the dark surface, the river carrying them toward the sea. Aya's eyes shone with the flames, and Yuki found himself studying the curve of her cheek, the way she bit her lip when she was moved. He thought of saying something, anything, but the right words stayed hidden, folded up like paper waiting for ink. Snow fell harder, dressing the night in silver. Aya tucked her chin into her scarf and leaned closer to him. He felt the weight of her shoulder against his and did not move away. The world shrank until it was just them, the cold river, and the lanterns burning steadily against the dark. When the last lantern left their sight, Aya turned to him. She pulled a folded slip of paper from her coat pocket and pressed it into his palm. Her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary. He opened it to see a small sketch, 2 lanterns side by side, tethered by a single thread of ink. He looked up, startled. She only smiled again, cheeks pink not from the cold this time. Yuki closed his hand around the drawing, the warmth of her touch still clinging to it. Somewhere above, a lantern drifted higher than the others, flames steady in the wind. He wondered if wishes could hear each other. They lingered at the riverbank, even after most of the crowd had dispersed. The cold gnawed at their boots, but neither seemed eager to leave. Aya spoke quietly about how her grandmother had taught her to fold the paper, how each crease represented a promise to carry forward. Yuki listened, his breath forming white clouds, wishing he had a story as beautiful to offer in return. Instead, he told her about the nights he stayed up too late studying, only to think of this festival and the light that lingered in his memory. She laughed softly, saying he always overthought things, but her eyes sparkled in a way that told him she understood. A vendor passed, selling roasted chestnuts, their smell rich and warm. Yuki bought some with trembling hands, offering the paper bag to Aya. She broke one open, steam rising, and handed half to him. They ate in silence, the heat sinking into their fingers, and for a moment it felt as though winter had given them a secret reprieve. When they finally walked back together, their footprints stretched side by side across the snow. Yuki glanced at her, watching the way her scarf trailed and her breath misted. Aya noticed and met his gaze for a moment, her cheeks warming with a blush that matched the faint glow of the lanterns still drifting behind them. For Yuki, the walk home had never felt so alive, as though each step carried the weight of something unspoken but shared. He realized then that sometimes words weren't necessary. Sometimes the lanterns spoke for them, carrying their wishes into the sky where silence could cradle them safely. He looked at Aya and saw the same realization flicker in her eyes. Their silence was no longer empty, it was full, brimming with the possibility of tomorrow. The rain came without warning, thick and sudden, hammering rooftops until the town seemed to blur. Sora sprinted from the bus stop, bag clutched over his head, but the storm won easily. He ducked under the shrine's old gate, breathless and dripping. He shook out his hair, muttering at the sky, and then froze. She was already there. Sitting on the stone steps, shoes beside her, toes brushing the wet moss, skirt damp at the hem. Her umbrella leaned forgotten against the railing. She looked up when he entered, eyes wide with recognition. It had been months since graduation, since everyone scattered to universities and cities, since promises of keeping in touch dissolved into silence. "Corey," he whispered, though the rain nearly swallowed her name. She blinked once, then smiled faintly, like a secret she had kept too long. He wanted to say everything at once, that he had missed her, that the city felt empty without her laugh, that he had carried her last text in his pocket like a charm, but the words tangled. Instead, he sat beside her, careful to leave the right kind of space. The rain filled the silence with its applause. They watched the garden flood slowly, raindrops bouncing like tiny dancers. Corey pulled her knees up, chin resting on them. "Do you remember," she said softly, "how we used to race to this shrine when we were kids? Whoever touched the gate first got to make the wish." Sora smiled despite the ache in his chest. "You always won. You always let me." He didn't deny it. Some truths needed no argument. Lightning cracked across the sky, and Corey shivered. Without thinking, Sora shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She looked at him, surprised, then drew it tighter. He caught the way her fingers pressed into the fabric, as though memorizing the warmth. Minutes stretched, the rain softened, then swelled again. Sora wanted to capture the moment, to freeze it before time resumed its cruel pace. "You're leaving again soon," he said finally. Corey nodded. "My program starts next week. Kyoto this time." Her voice carried both excitement and apology. "I don't know when I'll be back." He swallowed hard. The shrine's bell creaked in the wind. "I'll wait," he said quietly, surprising himself. "Doesn't matter how long." Her eyes widened, rainlight catching in them. For a breath, she said nothing, and the storm roared in their place. Then, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Her palm was cold, damp, trembling, but it fit against his like it had been meant to all along. They sat that way, hand in hand beneath the shrine gate, as the rain washed the world clean. No promises were spoken, but something older and stronger bound them in that silence. The storm would pass, the roads would dry, life would scatter them again, but this moment had been carved into both of them, unshakable. When the clouds finally thinned and light broke through, Corey slipped her shoes back on. She stood, pulling him gently to his feet, their hands still joined. They stepped into the rain's aftermath together, the air sharp and sweet. The path gleamed ahead, puddles catching fragments of the sky. As they walked, Corey told him about the city she was heading to, about the old streets lined with wooden houses, and the river where fireflies gathered in summer. Sora listened, committing every word to memory, even the way her voice softened when she spoke about missing home. He told her about his own routine since graduation, about how quiet the town felt without their friends, and how he always found himself returning to the shrine on rainy days, hoping for something he couldn't name until now. The road was slick, but they didn't mind the puddles. At one point, Corey slipped, laughing as Sora caught her arm to steady her. For a brief instant, she leaned against him, her face close enough for him to see the tiny droplets clinging to her eyelashes. He wanted to stay in that closeness forever, but she steadied herself and they walked on. At the base of the hill, they paused. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the kind that lingered even when the storm was gone. Corey looked at him, her expression tender and uncertain. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, slightly damp from the storm. She pressed it into his hand and whispered, "For when you miss me too much." When he opened it later, alone in his room, he found the pressed flower inside a small, delicate hydrangea, still carrying the faint scent of rain. Beneath it, in her careful handwriting, were the words, "Every wish we made at the shrine is still waiting for us." Sora closed his eyes, the memory of her hand in his lingering like the echo of the storm. Waiting suddenly didn't feel so heavy. It felt like hope dressed in rain, and he was ready to carry it as long as it took. The next morning, sunlight broke through in long, golden spears. The streets steamed as though exhaling. Sora walked past the shrine again, jacket still damp, flower carefully kept in his notebook. The air still smelled faintly of rain, and for the first time in months, the world seemed less lonely. Every step reminded him of her hand in his, every gust of wind like her laughter brushing past. Waiting didn't seem empty anymore. It seemed full of promise, of summer rain lingering even after the clouds had gone. The old library smelled of cedar and dust, a place where the world seemed to pause. Rows of tall shelves pressed close like quiet guardians, and stained glass windows painted shifting colors across the wooden floor. Students came and went during exam season, but in the farthest corner, behind a cracked glass lamp, Aoi always sat with her notebooks piled in precise towers. She wrote with a fountain pen, the kind that scratched faintly but gracefully against paper. Nobody knew what she was always writing class notes, perhaps, or a secret diary, but everyone knew that seat belonged to her. Ren discovered her by accident. He had been searching for a philosophy book rumored to hide in the neglected back shelves, and when he turned into the aisle, he caught sight of her hair tied loosely, lips pressed in concentration, wrists smudged with ink. She didn't notice him at first. When she finally looked up, startled, he muttered an apology and reached for a book he didn't even want. Their eyes met briefly, long enough for Ren to feel he'd trespassed into a world that was never meant to be disturbed. After that day, he found excuses to linger. He claimed the table nearest hers, sometimes pretending to study, sometimes sketching quietly in his notebook. Ren drew fragments of what he saw, the tilt of her head as she read, the way her hand hovered before she wrote something important, the curve of light across her cheek from the cracked lamp. He never meant for her to notice. But one evening, when the library was nearly empty and the snow outside muffled the city into silence, she leaned across the table and asked softly, "Why do you look at me like that?" His pencil froze. Heat rushed to his face. He tried to deny it, but she tilted her head, waiting. With trembling hands, he turned his notebook toward her. On the page was her likeness, imperfect, hurried, but unmistakably her. For a moment she said nothing, and he cursed himself for being foolish. Then she smiled faintly and whispered, "You made me look calmer than I feel." That was how it began. Slowly, awkwardly, as if two quiet worlds had collided and had to learn each other's language. Ren drew, Aoi wrote. She began to leave folded notes on his desk when he went to fetch a book, single sentences that read like fragments of poetry. Snow feels like forgotten laughter. Lantern light tastes like honey. Silence is a kind of answer. He kept every slip, tucking them into his sketchbook until it thickened with her words. In return, he began sketching not just her face, but the things she wrote about. The curve of a lantern glowing in the dusk. Hands cupping snowflakes, the outline of a smile he imagined from her sentences. The library became their universe. They spoke rarely, but when they did, each word carried weight. One winter evening, Allie confessed she came there because her house was always loud with arguments she couldn't silence. Books and ink gave her peace. Wren admitted he came because he had grown tired of the city's noise, the endless race to be seen, and in the library he finally felt invisible in a way that didn't hurt. Invisible until he met her. Weeks passed. The snow melted into hesitant spring. Their exchanges grew bolder. She began to read passages aloud from the books she loved, her voice soft but steady while he sketched beside her. Sometimes he drew her mid-sentence, lips curved around words he couldn't hear fully because he was too busy capturing the shape of her speaking. She teased him for that, writing on one of her notes, "Do you ever look at me without drawing me?" He had written beneath it, "No." The first time their hands touched was accidental. They both reached for the same pen that had rolled between them, and when their fingers brushed, neither pulled away immediately. The air grew heavy, as though the library itself leaned closer to listen. Allie withdrew first, cheeks flushed, but later she left him a note that said simply, "Warm," one evening, when cherry blossoms were just beginning to scatter across the courtyard outside. Wren arrived to find her corner empty. He sat waiting, tapping his pencil against paper, hours stretching. She didn't come. The next day, the same. By the third day, worry gnawed at him. He searched the campus, finally finding her on a bench beneath the blossoms, notebook closed on her lap. Her eyes were red, though she tried to hide it. She told him, haltingly, that her family had decided to move overseas for her father's work. They would leave at the start of summer. She had known for weeks, but she hadn't told him because writing it down would make it real. The words spilled like cracks across porcelain, quiet but breaking something inside both of them. Wren couldn't speak at first. He wanted to shout, to demand she stay, but he saw the weight in her shoulders, the resignation in her smile. So instead, he sat beside her and opened his sketchbook. He drew quickly, blossoms falling onto the page like pale snow, stitching her sitting there, small and strong and heartbreakingly present. When he finished, he tore the page carefully and pressed it into her notebook. "So you won't forget this place?" he said. Her eyes shimmered as she slipped one of her notes between the pages of his sketchbook and returned. "Even if oceans stretch, silence will still carry your echo." The days that followed felt suspended, each moment precious and fragile. They still met in the library, but everything was sharper now, the scratch of pen, the smell of paper, the way her hair fell loose from its tie. Every detail was a memory they were already grieving. Wren filled page after page with her face, her gestures, the library corner that would soon feel unbearably empty. Allie left more notes than ever, small declarations hidden in metaphors. "Your eyes are storms that don't frighten me." "Ink is braver when it knows you will read it." "Goodbyes are just another kind of hello." The night before she was to leave, they met one last time at the library. It was closed officially, but Wren had begged the janitor for a few minutes, and the old man had smiled knowingly. The lamps were dim, shadows pooling between the shelves. They sat across from each other, silent, their usual fortress of books and papers surrounding them. Then Allie slid her notebook across the table. On its last page was not writing, but a sketch her attempt at capturing him, lines unsteady but full of effort. He stared at it, throat tightening. "You drew me," he whispered. She nodded. "So I don't forget the way you look when you re-lost in thought." They sat like that, eyes locked, until the silence grew too heavy to bear. Wren reached across the table. This time when their hands met, neither let go. He stood, moving around the table, and she rose to meet him. The shelves, the stained glass, the cedar air all blurred into the background. For once there were no notes, no sketches, just the two of them, holding on as if their touch could defy distance. Outside, the night was soft with wind carrying petals through the air. They walked together to the gate where a taxi waited. Neither spoke because words had already said enough. When she finally stepped inside, she pressed her notebook to her chest and looked at him one last time. Then the car pulled away, carrying her into the blur of city lights. Ren stood beneath the drifting blossoms until the street grew empty. In his hand, he still held her final note, given in the library before they left. Echoes never fade if you keep listening. Years later, whenever he entered a library, he still found himself drifting to the farthest corner, half expecting to see her behind the cracked lamp, pen in hand. The shelves never answered, but in the quiet he sometimes thought he could still hear her voice. Soft as turning pages, reminding him that some stories don't end, they echo. The summer festival returned every year with the same comforting rhythm. Lanterns strung across narrow streets, goldfish scooping stalls lined up beside candied fruit, and the smell of grilled corn drifting through the warm night air. For Haru, it had always been background, something he passed through on his way to other plans. But this year felt different. This year, he caught sight of Reina beneath the painted lanterns, her yukata a deep indigo patterned with small white flowers, her hair pulled up with a ribbon that seemed to glow under the festival lights. She stood by the ring-toss stall, laughing with a group of friends. Haru hesitated, weaving through the crowd until she noticed him. Their eyes met, and for a moment the noise of the festival dulled. She excused herself, walking toward him with a smile that made his chest tighten. "You came," she said, tilting her head, as if she had doubted he would. "I told you I would," he replied, though his voice came out softer than intended. They walked side by side through the festival. Reina stopped to admire masks shaped like foxes and rabbits, brushing her fingers over the painted wood. Haru bought her one without a word, handing it to her as she blinked in surprise. She tied the ribbon loosely around her head, letting the fox mask rest to the side. "Do I look mysterious now?" she teased. "Mysterious, yes," he said, "but still the same Reina." Her laugh was carried away by the summer wind. They continued on, trying games, sharing grilled squid and shaved ice. With each small moment, the space between them shrank. Haru noticed details he hadn't before, the way she leaned slightly when listening, the way she bit her lip when deciding on a flavor, the brightness in her eyes when she won a small prize from a shooting stall. Every detail rooted itself in him, impossible to ignore. The path toward the shrine grew crowded as the evening deepened. Lanterns flickered to life in a warm glow, and stalls burst with voices calling out deals. Reina tugged Haru toward the candy stand, where sugar-coated apples glistened under the lantern light. He watched her choose one carefully, her expression far too serious for such a simple decision, and found himself laughing. She caught him and jabbed the stick playfully in his direction before taking a bite, crimson sugar cracking under her teeth. He accepted her offer of a bite, the sweetness clinging to his lips longer than expected. They lingered near the festival stage where musicians played shamisen and taiko drums, their rhythm echoing across the grounds. Reina swayed lightly with the music, her sleeve brushing his arm. The air seemed to hum between them. Haru thought about reaching for her hand, but his courage faltered. He feared the moment would shatter if he moved too quickly. When they reached the riverbank where the fireworks would soon begin, the crowd was already gathering. Reina found a spot near the edge and sat, patting the ground beside her. Haru sat too, their shoulders brushing, and for once he didn't pull away. The lanterns flickered along the water, reflections trembling as the current moved slowly. Fireflies drifted lazily above the reeds, their faint glow adding another kind of magic to the evening. The first fireworks streaked into the sky, and Reina's eyes widened, the light sparking in them as though she had absorbed it. The explosion painted the night in crimson, then gold. She clasped her hands together without realizing it, as if making a wish. Haru found himself watching her more than the fireworks, the bursts of color framing her profile like something fleeting but eternal all at once. "It's beautiful," she murmured, gaze fixed upward. He nodded, though his eyes were on her. Yeah, beautiful. A silence fell between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that filled itself with heartbeat and breath, with the closeness of two people on the verge of something unspoken. Haru's hand rested on the grass, fingers brushing against hers. She didn't move away. Instead, her fingers shifted, curling slowly until they interlaced with his. The fireworks thundered overhead, but the louder sound was the rush of blood in his ears. Haru dared a glance at her, and Reina turned to meet it. Their eyes locked, and in the glow of the bursting sky, she smiled, a small, certain smile that told him she felt it too. The finale came in a storm of light, colors raining across the night as though the stars themselves had shattered. When the echoes faded and the crowd began to stir, neither Haru nor Reina moved. Their hands remained joined, steady in the aftermath. Time itself seemed reluctant to start again. On the walk back through the lantern-lit streets, Reina stopped at the shrine entrance. She faced him, fox mask tilted, ribbon trailing against her neck. "Thank you for tonight," she said, her voice softer now, almost lost beneath the chatter around them. "Thank you," Haru replied, though he wasn't sure if she heard the full weight of what he meant. She stepped closer, the crowd moving past them like a river around a rock. "Let's come again next year," she whispered. "Together." Haru felt the words lodge deep inside him, a promise disguised as an invitation. He squeezed her hand gently, and for once, he didn't need to overthink it. "Together," he said. The streets began to thin as they walked toward the station. Vendors doused lanterns, children clutched prizes, and the night cooled with the faint scent of fireworks smoke. Reina slowed her steps, unwilling to let the evening end, and Haru matched her pace. They passed the goldfish stalls again, watching the fish flicker like living jewels in shallow pools. Reina bent to look closer, her reflection rippling in the water. Haru leaned beside her, their shoulders almost touching, and whispered without thinking, "You shine more than they do." She laughed, embarrassed but pleased, and splashed a little water in his direction. The train platform buzzed with festival goers heading home. Haru and Reina stood together at the edge, the night breeze carrying the faint echo of drums still playing in the distance. The train arrived with a rush of air, but neither moved immediately. When they finally stepped inside, the car rocked gently as it carried them away from the lit streets. They stood close, her hand brushing against his as she leaned slightly for balance. Without hesitation this time, Haru took her hand in his once more. She squeezed back, eyes closing as though savoring the memory already. The city lights blurred past outside, but inside the train, the world felt still. Haru realized then that the festival wasn't just an annual event anymore. It had become the beginning of something new, something fragile and dazzling like fireworks suspended in the night sky. When they parted at the station, Reina paused before leaving. She turned, fox mask hanging loosely at her side, and said with quiet certainty, "Don't forget tonight." "As if I could," Haru replied. She smiled and disappeared into the crowd. Haru watched until he couldn't see her anymore, his chest still echoing with the rhythm of fireworks. For the first time, he wished summer would last forever, because in its fleeting brilliance it had given him Reina and the promise of more nights just as bright. Kento always caught the 7:42 morning train from his neighborhood station, a ritual carved out of routine. The train was rarely on time, and the platform always smelled faintly of steel and fried bread from the kiosk at the corner. He never expected much to change there, but change arrived one morning in the form of a girl standing a few meters away, earbuds tucked in, eyes fixed on the tracks. Her name, he would later learn, was Arisa. She boarded the same train, always stepping into the second car. She held a paperback in one hand, marking her place with a train ticket stub. Kento noticed the details without intending to. The way she tilted her head when the announcer's voice crackled. The way she always gave her seat to the elderly, the faint smile she wore when her book carried her away. For weeks they rode the same train without speaking. Their lives intersected in silence, strangers sharing the same slice of time each morning. Yet Kento found himself shifting closer, choosing a handrail near hers, feeling oddly grounded by her presence in the rush of strangers. One rainy morning, the train jolted harder than usual, and Arisa's book slipped from her grasp. Kento bent quickly, handing it back. Her fingers brushed his as she accepted it, and her lips curved into a quiet smile. It lasted only seconds, yet it lingered in him the entire day. From then on, their mornings carried a fragile awareness. A nod, a fleeting smile, an unspoken recognition that the other existed. No words were exchanged, yet the silence grew heavier, as though waiting for something more. Months passed in this quiet rhythm, then suddenly she disappeared. Kento kept boarding the 742, scanning for her at the platform, but she was gone. He told himself not to care, she was a stranger after all. But each passing day without her left the train car emptier, the routine duller. He carried on, yet a piece of his mornings had vanished with her absence. Weeks later, on a crisp winter evening, he stopped at a corner cafe to escape the wind. As he reached for the sugar at the counter, a familiar voice asked the barista for tea. He turned. It was her. She looked almost startled to see him, then smiled faintly, the same way she had on the train. This time, they shared a table. Conversation flowed awkwardly at first, then more easily. She told him she had been working part-time while preparing for graduate school. Her schedule shifted by a new job across town. He admitted he had wondered where she had gone. Something soft in her expression at that. Their meetings became intentional after that. Not only trains and chance encounters, but planned coffees, walks along the river after work, texts that stretched into the night. Slowly, silence gave way to something deeper. Yet beneath their closeness, Kento noticed something guarded in her. She often deflected questions about her family. Sometimes her eyes drifted away, heavy with thoughts she didn't voice. He didn't press, but the weight lingered between them. One evening, while waiting for her at the cafe, Kento found a thin envelope tucked beneath the sugar jar at their usual table. His name was written across it in delicate handwriting he recognized. Heart pounding, he unfolded it. The letter revealed pieces of her life she had never said aloud. She had once lived nearby, but moved suddenly after her parents' divorce. She had kept the train ticket stub as a bookmark from the last ride she'd taken before everything changed. Boarding the train again months ago, she hadn't expected to find comfort in routine or in someone else's presence. She wrote that their silent companionship had given her strength when she felt adrift. The letter ended with a line that made his breath catch. If you feel the same, maybe one day you'll tell me. If not, then at least I'll have said what I never dared to before. When Arisa arrived moments later, cheeks flushed from the cold, she found him still holding the letter. Her steps faltered as she realized what he had read. She froze, eyes wide with the same guardedness he had often seen. Kento's answer was wordless. He reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his. She let out a quiet breath, the tension dissolving as her shoulders dropped. Her fingers tightened around his, fragile but certain. Outside, trains rumbled faintly in the distance, carrying strangers through the city's arteries. But here in the corner cafe, time slowed. The letter lay between them, no longer a secret, but a bridge. Their story wasn't dramatic, nor marked by fireworks or declarations. It was built in the quiet on trains, and coffees shared, and silences that grew into trust. The mystery that lingered in her had been revealed, not as a wall, but as a doorway. And as winter gave way to spring, Kento and Arisa walked side by side, knowing that what had begun as passing strangers on a train had become something lasting, something they had both been waiting for. Haruka moved into her small Tokyo apartment in late spring, when the rains had begun to linger across the rooftops. The place wasn't much, thin walls, narrow hallways, a balcony just wide enough for a potted plant, but it was hers. She unpacked boxes into silence, the hum of the refrigerator her only company. The first time she noticed her upstairs neighbor was through sound. A faint tapping filtered through the ceiling late at night, not loud enough to disturb, but steady enough to draw attention. Sometimes it was accompanied by the drag of furniture, sometimes the muted thrum of music. She imagined an insomniac, or someone working too late. She never saw him in the hallways. Then came the night of the storm. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled through the narrow street. Power flickered, then vanished, plunging the building into sudden darkness. Haruka sat on the floor with a flashlight, trying to steady her nerves, when footsteps descended the staircase. She opened her door slightly, just enough to see him, the neighbor from upstairs, holding candles in one hand, his expression calm in the chaos. He left one by her door before retreating without a word. By the time the lights returned, the candle had burned halfway. Its melted wax clung stubbornly to her windowsill, a reminder of a kindness from someone she had never spoken to. Days passed. Haruka caught glimpses of him at odd hours, collecting mail, locking his bicycle, pausing on the landing to check his phone. He moved with quiet efficiency, never lingering. Yet she noticed small things, how he watered the neglected plants by the entrance when no one was looking, how he carried groceries for the elderly tenant on the ground floor. His presence was unassuming, yet it softened the building's solitude. One evening, Haruka returned late to find an envelope slipped beneath her door. No name, no address, just a sheet of paper inside. On it was a single line written in neat handwriting. You are not the only one who hears the rain differently. The message unsettled her, though not unpleasantly. Was it meant for her? A mistake? She set it aside, but couldn't forget it. The next evening, she found another. Sometimes the quiet is heavier than the noise. A week later, the candle was never meant to be noticed. The notes came irregularly, each short, each slipped under her door without explanation. She never caught him leaving them, though she sensed it was him. Something in the tone carried the same quiet steadiness she had glimpsed in him. Curiosity turned to anticipation. She began to wait for the notes, unfolding each one with a strange flutter in her chest. They revealed little about him, yet hinted at shared solitude, at thoughts she had never spoken aloud. In the emptiness of her new life, they became a thread of connection. Then one night, no note appeared. Haruka told herself not to mind, but the silence pressed harder than usual. She stood on her balcony, staring up at the light from his window. It remained off. The following day passed without sign of him. 2-3 days, the building felt emptier, the hallways stretching longer. Worry crept in, though she had no right to it. They were strangers still, their only link unspoken words and a candle left in the dark. On the 4th day, a faint envelope appeared at her door once more. The handwriting was shakier this time. If absence feels heavier than presence, perhaps that's already an answer. Haruka sat with the note in her lap, the words circling in her mind. She realized then how much his quiet presence had rooted itself into her days. Without it, without him, the air felt thinner. She folded the note carefully, then slipped her own beneath his door upstairs. Absence only matters when someone is wanted back. That night, she couldn't sleep. The building remained still, save for the familiar tapping from his apartment. But this time, it no longer sounded like a stranger's noise. It was proof he was there, above her, listening to the same rain. Over time, the notes stopped being anonymous. They began to leave them openly, folded on each other's doorsteps. They wrote of small things, the smell of curry drifting from the restaurant down the street, the relief of cool air after rain, the loneliness that softened when footsteps echoed above or below. They didn't need to exchange names. The building itself carried enough of them in its walls. Spring melted into summer, cicadas humming through long evenings. Haruka returned home one day to find a larger envelope at her door. Inside was no note, but a key. Attached was a slip of paper, for when silence becomes too much. She hesitated for hours, staring at the key, unsure if crossing that line would shatter the fragile world they had built. When she finally climbed the stairs and knocked, the door opened almost instantly, as if he had been waiting. He stood there, not with mystery, but with the same calm presence she had always sensed. His name was Riku, she learned. He invited her inside, where the room mirrored hers narrow balcony, small kitchen. Walls lined with faint marks of life lived quietly. They spoke at last, their voices sounding almost foreign after so many months of silence and notes. Yet the ease between them was undeniable, built already from the words they had shared without speaking. That evening stretched long, filled with stories half told and glances more certain than confessions. Haruka left close to midnight, the candle he had once given her now sitting on his table between them. The notes eventually ceased, replaced by conversations, shared meals, evenings spent listening to the tapping of rain against their windows. But Haruka kept them all, tucked in a box beneath her bed. They were reminders of how something had begun, not with introductions or declarations, but with quiet, persistent presence. The mystery of the notes no longer mattered. What mattered was that two lives, once parallel in solitude, had found a way to meet through the thin walls of an old apartment. And in the steady rhythm of rain and silence, Haruka and Riku discovered that love could begin in the smallest gestures, unseen, unheard, until absence made it impossible to ignore. Haruka moved into her small Tokyo apartment in late spring, when the rains had begun to linger across the rooftops. The place wasn't much: thin walls, narrow hallways, a balcony just wide enough for a potted plant, but it was hers. She unpacked boxes into silence, the hum of the refrigerator her only company. The first time she noticed her upstairs neighbor was through sound. A faint tapping filtered through the ceiling late at night, not loud enough to disturb, but steady enough to draw attention. Sometimes it was accompanied by the drag of furniture, sometimes the muted thrum of music. She imagined an insomniac, or someone working too late. She never saw him in the hallways. Then came the night of the storm. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled through the narrow street. Power flickered, then vanished, plunging the building into sudden darkness. Haruka sat on the floor with a flashlight, trying to steady her nerves, when footsteps descended the staircase. She opened her door slightly, just enough to see him, the neighbor from upstairs, holding candles in one hand, his expression calm in the chaos. He left one by her door before retreating without a word. By the time the lights returned, the candle had burned halfway. Its melted wax clung stubbornly to her windowsill, a reminder of a kindness from someone she had never spoken to. Days passed. Haruka caught glimpses of him at odd hours, collecting mail, locking his bicycle, pausing on the landing to check his phone. He moved with quiet efficiency, never lingering. Yet she noticed small things: how he watered the neglected plants by the entrance when no one was looking, how he carried groceries for the elderly tenant on the ground floor. His presence was unassuming, yet it softened the building's solitude. One evening, Haruka returned late to find an envelope slipped beneath her door. No name, no address, just a sheet of paper inside. On it was a single line written in neat handwriting: "You are not the only one who hears the rain differently." The message unsettled her, though not unpleasantly. Was it meant for her? A mistake? She set it aside, but couldn't forget it. The next evening, she found another. Sometimes the quiet is heavier than the noise. A week later, the candle was never meant to be noticed. The notes came irregularly, each short, each slipped under her door without explanation. She never caught him leaving them, though she sensed it was him. Something in the tone carried the same quiet steadiness she had glimpsed in him. Curiosity turned to anticipation. She began to wait for the notes, unfolding each one with a strange flutter in her chest. They revealed little about him, yet hinted at shared solitude, at thoughts she had never spoken aloud. In the emptiness of her new life, they became a thread of connection. Then one night, no note appeared. Haruka told herself not to mind, but the silence pressed harder than usual. She stood on her balcony, staring up at the light from his window. It remained off. The following day passed without sign of him. 2-3 days, the building felt emptier, the hallways stretching longer. Worry crept in, though she had no right to it. They were strangers still, their only link unspoken words and a candle left in the dark. On the 4th day, a faint envelope appeared at her door once more. The handwriting was shakier this time. If absence feels heavier than presence, perhaps that's already an answer. Haruka sat with the note in her lap, the words circling in her mind. She realized then how much his quiet presence had rooted itself into her days. Without him, the air felt thinner. She folded the note carefully, then slipped her own beneath his door upstairs. Absence only matters when someone is wanted back. That night, she couldn't sleep. The building remained still, save for the familiar tapping from his apartment. But this time, it no longer sounded like a stranger's noise. It was proof he was there, above her, listening to the same rain. Over time, the notes stopped being anonymous. They began to leave them openly, folded on each other's doorsteps. They wrote of small things, the smell of curry drifting from the restaurant down the street, the relief of cool air after rain, the loneliness that softened when footsteps echoed above or below. They didn't need to exchange names. The building itself carried enough of them in its walls. Spring melted into summer, cicadas humming through long evenings. Haruka returned home one day to find a larger envelope at her door. Inside was no note, but a key. Attached was a slip of paper, for when silence becomes too much. She hesitated for hours, staring at the key, unsure if crossing that line would shatter the fragile world they had built. When she finally climbed the stairs and knocked, the door opened almost instantly, as if he had been waiting. He stood there, not with mystery, but with the same calm presence she had always sensed. His name was Riku, she learned. He invited her inside, where the room mirrored hers narrow balcony, small kitchen. Walls lined with faint marks of life lived quietly. They spoke at last, their voices sounding almost foreign after so many months of silence and notes. Yet the ease between them was undeniable, built already from the words they had shared without speaking. That evening stretched long, filled with stories half told and glances more certain than confessions. Haruka left close to midnight, the candle he had once given her now sitting on his table between them. The notes eventually ceased, replaced by conversations, shared meals, evenings spent listening to the tapping of rain against their windows. But Haruka kept them all, tucked in a box beneath her bed. They were reminders of how something had begun not with introductions or declarations, but with quiet, persistent presence. The mystery of the notes no longer mattered. What mattered was that two lives, once parallel in solitude, had found a way to meet through the thin walls of an old apartment. And in the steady rhythm of rain and silence, Haruka and Riku discovered that love could begin in the smallest gestures, unseen, unheard, until absence made it impossible to ignore. The bakery on the corner had always been there, its windows fogged in winter, its doorway fragrant with the comfort of flour, sugar, and butter. On cold mornings, when the city moved slowly under gray skies, the warm glow spilling from its glass door was like a small beacon calling out to anyone passing by. Aya had worked there since the start of autumn. She had grown accustomed to the steady rhythm of early mornings, the clatter of trays, the hiss of the ovens, the hush before customers arrived. There was something healing in kneading dough, in shaping rolls with her hands, in watching them rise in the oven until they turned golden. Her grandmother used to say that bread carried the warmth of the one who baked it, and Aya believed it. The bell above the bakery door jingled precisely at 7:30 each morning. It was always the same sound and always the same customer. Riku, a university student who passed by the bakery on his way to class, stepped in daily with the quiet confidence of routine. He never looked rushed, though Aya knew he must have been balancing studies and work. He ordered the same thing every morning, a small ampan and a cup of black coffee. He sat at the same table by the window, notebook open, pen in hand, as though the bakery itself had become his sanctuary. Aya had noticed him from the very beginning, not just because of the consistency of his visits, but because of the way he carried himself. He was never buried in his phone. Instead, he wrote pages and pages of notes, sometimes sketches, sometimes lines she could not decipher. He had the look of someone who carried many thoughts, but let very few slip out into the world. At first, their interactions were the bare minimum, the polite exchange of order and payment, her gentle thank you, his small nod in return. Yet over time, something shifted. It was in the way he sometimes lingered when receiving his change, or the way his eyes softened when she handed him the tray. One morning, when she placed the bread before him, their fingers brushed. And though Aya quickly pulled back, the memory lingered like the warmth of an oven even after it had been switched off. Winter deepened. Snow began to dust the streets outside, and the bakery became even more of a refuge. One particularly cold morning, when Aya was arranging a tray of melonpan in the display, she noticed Riku seated at his usual table, staring at the notebook but not writing. His hands were clasped around his coffee cup, as though he needed its heat to steady himself. She hesitated, then carried a fresh roll to his table, setting it down with a small smile. His surprised expression softened to something grateful, something that reached beyond words. It was a small act, but it broke the invisible wall between them. From that day on, their interaction stretched past routine. Aya began to notice his preferences, how he always saved the sweet bean filling for his last bite, how he preferred the crusty edges of baguettes, how his expression eased when she offered something new to try. Riku, in turn, began to look at her not just as the girl behind the counter, but as someone whose presence warmed the bakery itself. The heart of winter arrived in the form of a heavy snowfall. That morning, fewer customers came. The streets were silent except for the crunch of boots against ice. Aya kept the ovens running, filling the bakery with warmth, even if only a handful of people would step through the door. She had just begun to wipe down a table when the familiar jingle sounded. Riku entered, brushing snow from his shoulders. He looked colder than usual, but his eyes softened when they met hers. Aya prepared his usual order, but when she handed it to him, she noticed his hands trembled faintly from the cold. Without thinking, she placed a second pastry on the tray, a custard bun fresh from the oven. He looked at it, then at her, and though he said nothing, his expression carried an emotion that needed no explanation. As he sat, Aya found herself stealing glances from the counter. Riku had taken out his notebook again, but this time he wrote slowly, carefully, as though the words carried weight. At one point, he paused, closed the book, and instead simply watched the snow fall through the window. His expression was calm, yet tinged with something bittersweet. The bell jingled again as the door opened, and a sharp gust of wind rushed inside. Aya hurried to close it, and when she turned, she caught sight of Riku rising from his chair. He walked to the counter, notebook in hand. For a moment, Aya thought he might show her what was inside, but instead, he slid a folded piece of paper across the counter. He met her eyes briefly, the faintest of smiles tugging at his lips, before stepping out into the snow. Aya stared at the paper, heart pounding. She waited until the bakery was empty before opening it. Inside, in neat handwriting, was a single line. "This place feels like home because of you." The words were simple, but Aya felt them settle deep inside her, warmer than any oven, brighter than any lamp. Her cheeks burned, and she pressed the paper to her chest, unsure whether to laugh or cry. For the rest of the day, the bakery seemed filled with a different kind of warmth, one that didn't come from the ovens alone. Riku returned the next morning, as he always did. Aya greeted him with his usual ampan and coffee, but this time, their eyes lingered a little longer, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who had begun to understand each other, who needed fewer words because their feelings were beginning to speak on their behalf. As the days turned into weeks, their bond deepened. Sometimes they shared quiet mornings when no one else came, the only sounds the hum of the ovens and the scribble of his pen. Sometimes Aya slipped him a pastry on the house, and sometimes he left a folded note in return, always short, always thoughtful, each one a piece of himself. They never spoke directly of what was happening between them, but both felt the shift, steady and certain, like dough rising patiently until ready to become something more. By the time spring came and the snow melted from the streets, the bakery had become something greater than a workplace for Aya and more than a stop for Riku. It had become their meeting point, their unspoken promise, their shared beginning. One morning, when Aya unlocked the bakery doors, the air carried the faintest scent of cherry blossoms from the avenue outside. She arranged the trays, polished the counter, and glanced at the clock. Right on cue, the bell above the door jingled, and Riku stepped inside, the morning light framing him. His eyes met hers, and in that simple moment, between the warmth of bread and the quiet promise of a new season, Aya realized that love sometimes arrived not with grand declarations, but with the steady, gentle rhythm of everyday mornings and the knowledge that someone had chosen to be there again and again. And as Riku settled into his seat by the window, notebook at his side, Aya brought him his usual order, this time with an extra pastry, just because. He looked up at her, smiled, and in that exchange of warmth, both knew that something beautiful had already begun, written not in words, but in the quiet rituals of bread, coffee, and presence.